What the video is about. An honest, expert-level look at Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British general who beat Rommel at El Alamein and commanded the ground forces on D-Day, yet was so arrogant that his own allies repeatedly wanted him fired, and so effective they never quite could. Viewers get 3 episodes examined with the myths stripped out and the historians' disagreements left in. The set-piece victory at El Alamein, the famous failure at Arnhem, and the Battle of the Bulge, where he did the job and then nearly wrecked the alliance with a single press conference. Style of talking: knowledgeable war history storyteller for an audience that already knows the basics. Confident but honest, willing to concede what was material superiority or ego rather than genius, opinion delivered after the evidence. Emotional arc runs from a hard-won triumph through a costly disaster to a strange story of a needed man who couldn't stop claiming credit. Who this video is for: serious history and military strategy viewers who dislike hype and reward accuracy, and anyone drawn in by the Rommel rivalry. Titles they'd click: Was Montgomery overrated? The General Eisenhower wanted to fire. The man who beat Rommel, honestly assessed. Key facts. Covered: the Second Battle of El Alamein in 1942, the set-piece attrition victory over Rommel, and the question of art versus arithmetic. Operation Market Garden in 1944, the failed gamble at Arnhem, and why historians still argue about it. The Battle of the Bulge in 1944 and 45, where Montgomery was needed, did the job, and nearly blew up the alliance. Most great generals are remembered for how they fought. This one is remembered, at least half the time, for how impossible he was to work with. Bernard Law Montgomery beat Rommel, the Desert Fox, in the battle that Churchill said marked the end of the beginning of the war. He commanded the ground forces on D-Day, the largest invasion in history. And by the turn of 1945, he had become so insufferable to his own allies that the Supreme Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, had a letter drafted that would have ended his command, and it took the frantic intervention of Montgomery's own Chief of Staff to save his job. So here's the paradox we're going to sit inside for the next 20 minutes. Montgomery was arrogant enough that his own side repeatedly wanted him gone, and good enough that they never quite could get rid of him. Both of those are true. And the interesting question isn't which one is the real Monty. It's how the same man could be both at once. We're going to do this honestly, because this is the kind of general the textbooks fight over. We'll look at the victory that made him a national hero, the disaster that his critics never let him forget, and the crisis where he was genuinely needed and still managed to nearly wreck the alliance in the aftermath. 3 moves. What was skill? What was material superiority? What was ego? Keep score, and tell me at the end whether you think he was a great general, a lucky manager of overwhelming resources, or something more complicated than either. Let's start in the desert. In the summer of 1942, the British position in North Africa was grim. Rommel had pushed the 8th Army back deep into Egypt, and the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline, was under real threat. Then, in August, Montgomery took command of the 8th Army. And the first thing to understand about him is what he did before he fought at all. He rebuilt the Army's confidence. The 8th Army had been beaten and knocked backwards for months, and morale was fragile. Montgomery went round, made himself visible, simplified the plan, told everyone exactly what was going to happen and that they were going to win. Whatever you think of the man, this is a real skill, and it's one his defenders rightly emphasize. An army that believes it will win fights differently. Now, the honest part, and if you know the period, you're already waiting for it. When Montgomery attacked at El Alamein in October 1942, he did so with overwhelming material superiority. Something like 2-to-1 in men, 2-to-1 in tanks, roughly 1,000 against about 550, and near total command of the air. And it wasn't just quantity. His new American Sherman and Grant tanks badly outclassed the obsolete Italian models that made up a big share of Rommel's armor, tanks that Allied crews considered near death traps. Rommel, by contrast, was chronically short of fuel and supplies, his lines strangled by Allied air and naval power in the Mediterranean. And Rommel himself was in Germany on sick leave when the battle opened. His stand-in died of a heart attack on the second day. So, let's be clear-eyed. This was not a David and Goliath story. If anything, Montgomery was Goliath. Some historians have argued Alamein was less a work of military art than of military arithmetic, a battle the Allies were always going to win once the numbers were stacked that high. But here's where I'd push back on the pure cynic view, and this is the actual tactical move. Montgomery understood something his predecessors hadn't. In the open desert, in a war of movement and maneuver, Rommel was the better general and would probably always win. So Montgomery refused to fight that battle. Instead, he deliberately chose a battle of attrition, a grinding, First World War-style set piece, on a narrow front hemmed in by the sea to the north and the impassable Katara Depression to the south, where Rommel couldn't use his genius for maneuver and where raw Allied material weight would simply tell. He called his method crumbling, methodically chewing through the Axis defenses, drawing Rommel's precious armor into counterattacks that broke against dug-in British guns. He opened with a huge artillery barrage and Operation Lightfoot, clearing lanes through the vast Axis minefields Rommel had nicknamed the Devil's Gardens. He backed it with an elaborate deception, Operation Bertram, dummy tanks massed in the south, real tanks in the north disguised as trucks, to hide where the blow would fall. And crucially, when Churchill pressed him to attack early, before he was ready, Montgomery flatly refused and made them wait until the odds were as crushing as he could make them. That's the point about Montgomery, and it's the key to the whole man. He wasn't a gambler. He was the opposite of Rommel. He would not fight until he had stacked every possible advantage in his favor, and then he applied them with relentless, unspectacular pressure until the enemy broke. After 12 days of brutal attrition, Rommel's line finally cracked. It was the first clear, irreversible British victory over the Germans in the war, and it made Montgomery a national hero. Now, a fair criticism even here. His pursuit afterwards was cautious, and a good part of Rommel's motorized force escaped to fight again. That caution is a theme we'll come back to. But here's my question for you, and I want the real debate in the comments. Is it a lesser achievement to win by refusing to fight on your enemy's terms and forcing him onto ground where your advantages decide it? Or is that exactly what generalship is? And if you're enjoying having the myth separated from the record, take a second to subscribe, because the next two moves are where that really matters. Because the next move is where his caution and his self-belief collided with something they couldn't overcome, and it produced the most famous failure of his career. By September 1944, the picture had transformed. Normandy was won. France was being liberated. The German army in the west seemed to be collapsing, and the Allied generals were arguing about how to finish the war by Christmas. Eisenhower favored a broad front, advancing everywhere at once. Montgomery wanted a single, narrow, powerful thrust, his thrust, driven deep into Germany. And for once, the cautious set-piece general proposed something wildly out of character. A gamble. The plan was Operation Market Garden, and it was genuinely bold. Drop 3 airborne divisions to seize a chain of bridges across the Netherlands, the American 101st and 82nd in the south around Eindhoven and Nijmegen, and the British 1st Airborne farthest north, at the last and biggest bridge, over the Rhine at Arnhem. Then send an armored corps, 30 corps, racing up a single road to relieve them, cross that final bridge, and outflank Germany's defenses into the industrial Ruhr. win it, and the war might end in 1944. It failed. And for a knowledgeable audience, the interesting thing is that historians still genuinely disagree about why. So let me give you the honest spread rather than a single tidy villain. There's the plan was doomed camp, led by writers like Antony Beevor, who argues the whole concept was flawed from the start. The entire operation depended on one narrow raised road through low, wet country where armor couldn't leave the tarmac, and Beevor calls relying on that single road, in his word, madness. One blown bridge, one determined ambush, and the whole timetable collapsed, which is more or less what happened. Then there's the intelligence was ignored camp. British reconnaissance and the Dutch resistance had indicated German armor refitting near Arnhem, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. A staff officer, Brian Urquhart, pushed the aerial photos in front of his superiors and was quietly sent on medical leave for nervous exhaustion. Now, I'll flag the nuance here, because some historians think this factor is overstated. The woods around Arnhem were not exactly packed with tanks, but there was enough armor and enough warning that the confidence was reckless. And then there are the execution failures that were nobody's grand theory, just things going wrong. The drop zones were placed roughly 8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge, throwing away surprise, because the airmen worried about anti-aircraft fire closer in. The airlift was staggered over several days because there weren't enough aircraft, so the force arrived piecemeal. The radios at Arnhem failed almost immediately, and 30 Corps, grinding up that single road under fire, simply couldn't reach the north in time. Only one British battalion, under Colonel John Frost, actually reached the Arnhem Bridge and held one end of it with extraordinary courage until they were overwhelmed. Of the roughly 10,000 men of the 1st Airborne dropped at Arnhem, only about 2,000 came back. The division was effectively destroyed. And here's the criticism that I think lands hardest, and it's the one his defenders find hardest to answer. To launch Market Garden, Montgomery deprioritized something arguably far more important: clearing the approaches to the great port of Antwerp, which the Allies had captured but couldn't yet use, because the Germans still held the estuary leading to it. The whole Allied advance was strangled by supply, and Antwerp was the answer to that. By chasing the glory of a Rhine crossing and leaving Antwerp for later, Montgomery arguably prolonged the supply crisis, and, with it, the war. Montgomery himself never really accepted this. He called himself, to the end of his life, Market Garden's unrepentant advocate, and insisted that had it only been properly resourced, it would have worked. That's worth sitting with, because it's the same self-belief that served him at Alamein, the absolute certainty in his own plan, only here it curdled into an inability to admit a costly mistake. So, second move. If you think Market Garden was a bold idea betrayed by bad luck and bad execution, say so in the comments. If you think it was a vain, flawed gamble that should never have been launched over securing Antwerp, say that. Because both cases have serious historians behind them, and I'd rather you argue it out than take my word. But the third move is the strangest of all, because it's a case where Montgomery was genuinely, badly needed, did the job, and still nearly blew up the entire alliance with his mouth. In December 1944, the Germans did the one thing nobody expected. They attacked. A massive surprise offensive smashed into a weakly held stretch of American line in the Ardennes forest, punching a huge bulge into the Allied front, hence the name. And the German breakthrough was so deep that it physically split the American command in two, cutting General Omar Bradley off from two of his own armies, stranded on the northern shoulder of the bulge. Eisenhower made a cool, sensible decision. Since Bradley couldn't reach those two American armies in the north, and Montgomery's forces were positioned right there, he temporarily handed command of the northern shoulder, including two American armies, to Montgomery. And credit where it's due. Montgomery did the job well. He was, whatever else you say about him, a superb organizer of a defensive battle. He gripped the northern flank, tidied up a chaotic line, moved units to plug gaps, and helped steady the front so the German drive could be contained and then thrown back. I want to be scrupulously fair about proportion here, because it matters. The Battle of the Bulge was overwhelmingly an American fight. American troops did the vast bulk of the fighting and the dying, something like 75,000 American casualties against a little over 1,000 British. Montgomery commanded on one flank, ably. He did not win the battle single-handed, and the German propaganda machine, and later Monty himself, would exaggerate his role. And that is exactly what makes the ending so revealing. Because in January 1945, with the battle won, Montgomery held a press conference. Here's the twist that most tellings get wrong, so let me be precise. If you actually read the text of what he said, it was mostly gracious. He praised the American soldier lavishly, called him a brave fighting man, said he never wanted to fight alongside better soldiers, and defended Eisenhower. On paper, it was fine. The initial American press reaction was even positive. But the manner of it, the tone, the self-satisfied way he framed the whole thing as Monty being called in to rescue the situation landed like a grenade. It played straight into a narrative the British press was already pushing, that Montgomery should be made overall land commander over the Americans, and that he'd bailed the Yanks out of a mess of their own making. To American generals like Bradley and Patton, who'd watched their men do the overwhelming majority of the bleeding, it was intolerable. Bradley was so incensed he gave his own furious press statement in reply. The alliance, at the top, nearly came apart. Churchill himself had to stand up in the House of Commons soon after and pointedly remind everyone that this had been overwhelmingly an American battle, fought with American blood. Now, in fairness, and this is a real historian's point, some argue Montgomery's actual intent that day was the opposite of what it achieved, that he was genuinely trying to defend Eisenhower from the British papers savaging him, and simply, catastrophically, misjudged the tone. Maybe. But that's almost the most damning reading of all, because it means the man was so tone-deaf to how he came across that he could set out to help and still nearly blow up the alliance. And this is the moment the whole paradox crystallizes. And here I want to be precise about the sequence, because it's even sharper than the popular version. The real breaking point actually came a week earlier, at the end of December, driven by the wider feud. Montgomery had been relentlessly pushing to be made overall Allied land commander over the Americans, and Eisenhower had finally had enough. On the 30th of December, Eisenhower drafted a message to the combined chiefs of staff that amounted to an ultimatum. Effectively, it's him or me. And as the historian Russell Weigley put it, that could only have produced one result: the replacement of Montgomery, with Field Marshal Alexander lined up to take his place. What saved Montgomery's career was his own chief of staff, Freddie de Guingand, who flew to Eisenhower's headquarters, persuaded him to hold the letter, and then broke the news to Montgomery. And the reaction is the tell. Monty was genuinely stunned. He'd assumed he was irreplaceable. Once he grasped how close he'd come to being sacked, he had de Guingand draft a hasty, almost groveling apology to Eisenhower, which he signed, "Your very devoted subordinate." Then, a week later, came that press conference, which reopened the wound just as it was scabbing over. Think about what that means. In the middle of a war they were winning, right after Montgomery had done genuinely useful work in the Ardennes. His own side's supreme commander had a letter drafted that would have ended his command, purely because he would not stop claiming primacy in a way that humiliated his allies. It took his own chief of staff to save him from himself. So the third move isn't a battle plan at all. It's the man himself, fully revealed, genuinely capable, genuinely needed, and genuinely incapable of the one thing a coalition general needs most: the grace to share credit. He was so good they'd given him American armies to command. He was so impossible that commanding them nearly got him fired. So, 3 moves, honestly weighed. At Alamein, he refused to fight Rommel's kind of battle and used overwhelming material weight to grind out the victory that made him a hero, though how much was art and how much was arithmetic, you can fairly argue. At Arnhem, his self-belief slipped its leash and produced a bold, flawed disaster that his critics never let him forget. And in the Ardennes, he did a difficult job well and then nearly detonated the alliance because he couldn't stop talking about it. Arrogant enough that his own side wanted him gone, good enough that they couldn't afford to lose him. That's the whole man, and neither half is the lie. So here's the question I asked you to keep. Weighing all 3, was Montgomery a great general, a careful manager of overwhelming resources who was lucky in his advantages, or something harder to pin down than either label? I've got my own view. I'd genuinely rather hear yours, so make the case in the comments and be specific about which move convinced you. And if you know someone who thinks the Desert War begins and ends with Rommel, send them this. The man who beat him is a far stranger story than the legend allows. Next time, we're going back to the Age of Sail, to a one-armed, one-eyed admiral who won the battle that saved Britain and died in the middle of winning it. Subscribe so you don't miss him. See you again soon.